In the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, we find a collections of teachings that are presented in those Gospels, both Matthew and Luke. They're presented as a sermon, and you'll know them as such, the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon in the Valley. Scholars aren't necessarily sure if they're an actual sermon or just a collection of Jesus's greatest hits. What we do know is if they were an actual sermon, it's one that Jesus seemed to give on a regular occasion or multiple occasions, because we see them in a couple different places. One version of it is in Matthew, another version is in Luke. They're similar, but clearly given to different audiences and with different word choices. Whatever it is, one thing is clear. These sermons, the Sermon on the Mount, Sermon in the Valley, represent the teachings of Jesus that the early church remembered and wanted us to remember. And these teachings are included so that 2,000 years later, when you'd be sitting in a building like this, you'd be reminded of these things that Jesus taught his followers. You could say this is Jesus' manifesto, his vision for the world, for people of faith. And it's in this collection of teachings that we find some beautifully difficult ideas. One of them, which is found both in Luke and Matthew, in both sermons, although their presentation is a little different, and if you're interested in the Bible study, you could compare the two, is this very simple teaching that is probably one of the hardest things Jesus taught, one of the many hard things that Jesus taught. We're going to read the version out of Matthew today, and it simply goes, "You have heard it said," I think I have a slide for this, hopefully. "You have heard it said, love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be children of your Father in heaven. He causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what's the big deal? Who cares? What reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your own people, what are you doing more than others? Don't even the pagans do that?" He says, "Love your enemies. And if you only love those who love you, are you really any different from anyone who's ever lived? Who's ever walked this earth?" We all find it easy to love those who love us. Today we're kicking off a series on what it looks like to navigate difficult relationships, what it means to live into Jesus' command to love our enemies. And before I go on, I just want to say something out loud for some of you I know are thinking this. You might be thinking, I don't have any enemies. And I just say, good for you, But at the same time, I want to encourage you that this sermon, I think, still applies to you. When we look at Jesus' command in Matthew to love his enemies, the word for enemies comes from the Greek word, the verb to hate. Here's just a brief definition of the word in Matthew. You can see the Greek word there, the definition meaning enemy, hostile, hated. The word origin, though, is derived from a primary verb meaning to hate. It's actually part of Jesus' logical argument here, because Jesus is like such a big fan of paradox, right? He says the first will be last, the last will be first. This is part of Jesus' philosophy, that the way in which we understand the world doesn't actually work that way, and it's kind of upside down. And so he says, don't just love those you love those you hate. Or love those who hate you. And I know hate is a strong word, so I want to expand it just a little bit more so that we can include hopefully most of you in this room. Jesus' invitation is to love those who you hate. Look at this list. I'm going to challenge you to think about it. Love those who you hate. Love those who hate you. Love those who have reason who you have reason to hate. Maybe you don't hate them because you're a good person, you're a good human. But if you thought about it, you have reason to hate them. Or those who have reason to hate you, even if they choose not to, because hate's a strong word. Those who find it easy to disagree with, who are actively trying to hurt you, who secretly wish things didn't go your way, or those you secretly wish didn't go their way, who you disagree with on the vision that you have for the world or that Jesus has for the world, or who make your life more difficult, or who you make their life more difficult. So pause and consider this list. Read through it carefully. Can you think of anyone? Can you think of people or people groups that might be identified as an enemy based on this definition? Now, if you're here and you still can't think of anyone in any of these categories, then why are you here exactly? Because you have reached perfection. Like John Wesley, our founder of the United Methodist Church, talked about growing in perfection. You've arrived. You have no enemies. In the most broadest definition I could fit onto a slide. And it's very impressive. For the rest of us, we're going to look at what it means to love our enemies. And when I say enemy throughout the sermon, you might think that's a strong word. I mean this. Your opponents. I trust you to be able to hear the words I say and interpret it in your context. So anyone on this list. So we're going to look at this by looking at the ways Jesus and the early church loved their enemies. And this is a good example because we know by our theology that Jesus didn't hate other people. Right? Jesus is God and God is love, so how could Jesus hate other people? But we also know that there were many who hated him or wanted to cause Jesus harm or wanted him and his teachings to go away or at the very least disagreed with his vision for the world. And we lump all of those under this banner of enemies, for better or for worse, whether they are enemies in that sort of traditional sort. So today we're going to look at one of these groups of people. The Pharisees, who are, for all intents and purposes, set up in the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, as the antagonists of Jesus. When you think of the Gospels as a story, the Pharisees are often presented as the antagonists, the people who are out to get Jesus. We're going to look at the Pharisees today. Next week, we're going to look at Judas, the story of one of Jesus' own disciples who rises up against Jesus. And then the following weeks after that, for 2 more weeks, we're going to look at how this plays out in the early church. We're going to look at the story of Stephen and what it looks like for him to forgive his enemies in the final moments of his life. And then we'll look at Paul, what it looks like for him to engage and have conversation with his enemies as he's navigating the Roman Empire. So that's where we're headed. But today we're going to look at the Gospel's favorite villains, the Pharisees. So let's talk about the Pharisees briefly here. The Pharisees, along with the scribes and the Sadducees, were often set up as enemies or antagonists of Jesus in the gospel stories, as I've said. There's countless stories throughout Jesus' life where you see them working against the mission of Jesus. But I want to define them briefly because they're often mentioned even in the 7 woes that Jesus offers the Pharisees and the scribes. So the scribes and the Pharisees are unique. I think this is the slide that I added. Scribes and Pharisees are unique. But overlapping categories of religious leaders during the time in the early church when they were writing the Gospels. They were also around when Jesus was there, but you could tell that the early church, as they're telling Jesus' stories, really focuses on these stories because these individuals had an immense amount of power later in the early church when the disciples were writing down the stories of Jesus. And so they overlap, but they're different. Scribes were a professional class with formal training, similar to lawyers in our society. Not the same, but kind of, they interpreted the law and they were well educated in that. They were schooled in the tradition of Judaism and how it applied to current issues. So not exactly like a lawyer, but similar. The Pharisees, on the other hand, were a group within Judaism that were defined by strictly religious rules. And this group, which makes it different than the scribes, were mostly lay individuals laypersons, which means they didn't go to the Jewish seminary or they didn't have formal theological training. So they were just members of the Jewish faith who had very strong views about what it meant to be Jewish. Now, some scribes were Pharisees, but very few Pharisees were scribes, so there's just a little bit of overlap. But together, they represented the Jewish leadership in the time when the Gospels were written. So this group of Pharisees, basically normal people, there's no rabbis or even theologically trained individuals, had built a cult or a community of really intense devotion to follow strict moral and religious rules as how they interpreted the Old Testament. And they, because they were so well organized together, even though they didn't necessarily represent the seminaries or the theologically educated in their society, they were very well organized, and they carried an immense amount of power in their society. They carried a lot of influence. And I have found that to be often the case. I found that when you give people religious authority, often who don't have proper theological education or mentoring or discipleship, they can become controlling and strict, and they can focus more on controlling people's behavior than understanding the heart of God. That's what was happening with the Pharisees. That doesn't happen anymore. That was back then, you see. We've evolved beyond that as people of faith. The simple reality is that power corrupts, and religious power also corrupts. And I bring this up, but I want to pause for just 1 second, because what's interesting is I never learned, if you read the Gospels, you'll never learn that the Pharisees were uneducated. Have you noticed that? How many knew that the Pharisees were not theologically trained? Did anyone know that before I said that? A few of you. You know, most likely you didn't learn it by reading the Bible, though. Like, it's not mentioned in the stories. It's not mentioned. Jesus actually has a significant number of critiques regarding the Pharisees, but he doesn't critique the fact that they are uneducated. I bring that up simply because the political and the theological left tend to use that as its primary argument against anyone they disagree with, and yet you don't see that in the way of Jesus. So that's just free. That's just extra. You can just take that, do what you want with it. But Jesus actually, when he argued with the Pharisees, argued with their ideas. He disagreed with them, and he engaged them and never belittled them. So we're talking about loving your enemies. You can do what you want with that. So I want to look, though, at there's a lot of stories that we could look at of Jesus' interactions with the Pharisees. He says some hard things. We could look at the horrible things they said about Jesus, the way they tried to get him crucified, which, is pretty bad. The critiques that Jesus made against them and what are known as the 7 woes to the Pharisees. And all of those would be great places to study. But we're in a series on loving your enemies, so we're going to look at an unlikely story. And it's a very simple story. And it's not about the Pharisees attacking Jesus, or about Jesus pushing back and disagreeing with the Pharisees directly, although it's part of the story. It's a much more civil story, and it's a story that starts like this. It's in Luke chapter 14. If you have your Bibles, you can go there. It'll be on the screen as well. And what's great about this story is if you weren't paying attention and you just read it, you'd skip over the first verse because it's just setting the scene. But I want us to recognize this. It simply says this. This is how the story starts. One Sabbath day. Hold on to that. It's going to be important later. It's the Sabbath. It's important. Jesus went to eat in the house of a well-known Pharisee. In this little verse, an introductory verse that, honestly, I'd probably skim over most times, just to get to the story. In this short little sentence, we are given one of the best pictures of what Jesus meant when he said, love your enemies. The Pharisees, who publicly ridiculed him and tried to discredit him, who played a role in him being arrested and sentenced to death, enemies by every definition of the word. And we have Jesus sitting down to share a meal with them. I've already asked you to think of somebody. When's the last time you shared a meal with them? I know, it's getting a little too personal, uncomfortable. And what's interesting about this is it's not just any Pharisee either. It's a leader of the Pharisees. It's a well-known, respected Pharisee. This was not going to be a secret meal. And you have to imagine that the town gossip is just going to light up, just running at full speed. Because, did you hear that Jesus is at so-and-so's house? And someone's like, oh, how is that possible? I thought they hated each other. Oh, yeah. I knew he was just like every other religious leader. He's going to turn out just like the Pharisees. Or maybe someone might say, good for him. Those Pharisees will set him straight, and he'll start stepping in line in no time. Jesus is sharing a meal at the house of this prominent Pharisee. Step one, to loving your enemies. Share a meal with them. Break bread together. I want to look at what happens. Let's keep reading. Continue with verse 1. On the Sabbath day, Jesus went to eat in the house of a well-known Pharisee. And while he was there, he was being carefully watched. Just in case you thought I was using some hyperbole here. No, this is like a big deal. Everyone's paying attention. In front of him was a man whose body was badly swollen. He's sick. He needs help. He needs a doctor. They don't have doctors. It's a long time ago. At least not ones that can help with his condition. And so Jesus turned to the Pharisees and the authorities on the law. So he turns to the Pharisees, who are that sort of powerful lay group of people who have the strict, and then the authorities on the law, these scribes, who kind of interpret the Old Testament. And he asks them, is it breaking the law to heal on the Sabbath? I want to set the scene for you just briefly. Most likely, he's eating in a prominent home of a Pharisee, which means this Pharisee was most likely wealthy. Those kind of go together most often. Prominence leads to wealth in most societies. So he's probably got a pretty nice house. This is the Mediterranean, so it's not just like a house. It's probably more like a series of homes with a courtyard. And they're most likely eating outside in that courtyard. And so in this courtyard, which is feels like almost like a public space, an individual walks into the courtyard who needs to be healed. Now, what you need to understand is the previous day, in the previous chapter, Luke chapter 13, Jesus healed somebody on the Sabbath. Now, the Sabbath, one of the great 10 commandments, right up there with murder, do not steal, do not take God's name in vain, is observe the Sabbath, which means you do not work on the Sabbath. And they had become so strict in abiding the Sabbath that when Jesus healed somebody on the Sabbath, he got yelled at by the synagogue ruler. So Jesus comes in, he's healing somebody on the Sabbath, and the person who's the synagogue ruler, so equivalent to like me, that and if you heal someone on Sunday, one of you all, you'll get talking to. And he calls Jesus out in front of everybody. It's Luke chapter 13. I think I have a verse for this, the next one. Luke 13, verse 14. There are 6 days for work. You can heal this person any of 6 days. So come and be healed on those days. But do not come on the Sabbath day. He thinks he's being reasonable. 1 day out of 7, where I'm just asking you not to be healed. 1 day out of 7. Jesus does heal the man, and he goes on to call out their hypocrisy. You can read it in Luke chapter 13. It's this whole public argument. And some day later, maybe the next day, maybe a week later, Jesus is now sitting down with Pharisees, with authorities on the law, these scribes, and an individual comes in on the Sabbath to be healed. They had to be aware of what had happened in chapter 13, right? And he asked them, is it breaking the law to heal on the Sabbath day? And he asked them this while the man who is swollen needs the healing, standing there awkwardly. I've found that it's one thing to believe something, and it's something else entirely to share that belief out loud in front of those who might be hurt by that belief? A lot of people believe terrible things, bad theology. But many of these people deep down are good. They've just been tricked into believing horrible things, and their fear has been manipulated and coerced. And when they meet somebody who would be hurt by that belief, they at times, not always, but at times change their mind. Or at the very least, don't say anything. Look what happens to the people at this dinner. The next verse, verse 4. But they remained silent. You can't say something nice. Yeah, their moms taught them that, I guess. I don't know. So Jesus took hold of the man and healed him, and then sent him away. Which is good. This is in my notes, but it's important to know. Jesus is about to give them a teaching. And thankfully, the man who got healed didn't have to hear it. He sent him away. I didn't notice that. But he's like, you don't need to hear this. Now I'm going to talk to you all. But these people, they remained silent. They weren't going to share their real beliefs, which we know what they are. They've already displayed it in previous chapters. They were going to display their real beliefs in front of the man who would be hurt by them, because this particular group of Pharisees and scribes, at the bottom, regardless of what they believe, they are good people. We have to believe that. And they believed that healing was work and that the Sabbath was rest. And so technically Jesus shouldn't heal this man on the Sabbath. But it's one thing to believe something theoretically. It's much harder to say you believe it when someone is standing in front of you who's going to be impacted by that belief. This is the first benefit of eating with our enemies, with sharing a meal with those we disagree with. And it's very simple. Our presence forces people to reconcile their beliefs with how those beliefs impact real people. I've seen this time and time again. By far, the number one reason an evangelical pastor becomes accepting of LGBTQ people is because someone they love comes out as gay. It's their relationship and proximity to a person that forces them to reconcile their faith with the way it might hurt someone they love. Another just random, I've seen angry conservative Christians go on and on about how we should build that wall. And then they go on a mission trip to Honduras and they hear stories of people who've been beaten and robbed and stolen and have to flee for their lives from gang violence, and their beliefs change because of their proximity to somebody who's vulnerable. What we believe in theory eventually has to be reconciled with the person standing in front of us. And in this particular story, this was only possible because Jesus sat down and ate with someone he disagreed with. Proximity to the vulnerable shapes our theology. And those who love the vulnerable must be willing to bring our presence into the lives of those who have bad theology so that their good hearts can win out. He doesn't just keep it there. As I said, he goes on and he lectures this particular group. I'm going to read it. It kind of speaks for itself. It could be its own sermon, but I think it's worth it. We're not going to read all of it because it's like the rest of the chapter where he gives them a good teaching, a good talking to. And they're speechless. So he's just like, let me say some things. And this is what he says. He asked them another question. He said, suppose one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on Sabbath day. Wouldn't you pull it out right away? And they had nothing to say. They're just, they're not getting into it. And so Jesus noticed how the guests, God bless him. This is what some pastors call meddling. Jesus is meddling here. Jesus noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, so he told them a story. I want to pause before I read the story. I want you to imagine that you were invited to someone's house, and you decided to share this story, okay? So just try to put yourself in this position. He says, suppose someone invites you to a wedding feast. Do you not take the place of honor? A person more important than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come to you. He will say, give this person your seat. Then you will be filled with shame. Which they're all like, I kind of am right now, You will have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place. Then your host will come over to you. He will say, friend, move up to a better place. Then you will be honored in front of all of your guests. All those who lift themselves up will be made humble. You know, this paradox of Jesus. You lift yourself up, you'll be humbled. And if you humble yourself, you'll be lifted up. And you should love those who hate. And those who are first are going to be last. And this is Jesus. This is the upside down kingdom we're meant to live in. And then verse 12, then Jesus spoke to the host. Suppose you give a lunch or a dinner. He said, do not invite your friends, your brothers, or your sisters, or your relatives, or your rich neighbors. He adds rich to the neighbors. Which means he has other neighbors who aren't. As we all do, regardless of what neighborhood you live in. He says, if you do, they might invite you to eat with them, and so you will be paid back. It'll be mutual. But when you give a banquet, invite those who are poor. Also invite those who can't see or walk. Then you will be blessed. Your guests can't pay you back, but you will be paid back when those who are right with God rise from the dead. And what's great about this is he's just getting started. He goes on to continue to tell additional parables to this dinner party. But here's what I love about this story. Jesus doesn't hold back. He gets into it. He tells them exactly how he feels. And he tells them exactly how the kingdom of God is supposed to work and what it means to love those who are vulnerable. One of the benefits of sharing a meal with people we disagree with is it forces them to reconcile what they believe with the way it impacts real people. This isn't for everyone. I'm not suggesting you do this. I'm just suggesting if you have that kind of privilege or that kind of, if you're comfortable with that, that's a good thing to do. The second benefit is this, is you have a chance to share a different perspective on what it means to follow God. And this takes great courage and the opportunity and the strength to speak freely, which we don't always have in these settings. But there's this deeper lesson here. Jesus didn't just eat with his enemies like a politician would, with the goal of winning them over to his cause, making them sort of disciples by being nice and not discussing anything controversial. Jesus was still true to his faith, even at the risk of upsetting people he was sharing a meal with. It doesn't work out great for Jesus if you remember how the story ends. I mean, resurrection-wise it does, but like before the resurrection, it doesn't work out great. So this isn't Pastor Joe advice. I'm just saying this is Jesus, okay? And you can do what you want with that. It got him into a lot of trouble, but he didn't change who he was because of who he was with. And I think the hardest part of loving our enemies or loving those we disagree with is this, and I put it up on the screen so we can really sit with it. Loving your enemies doesn't mean changing who you are so that your enemies love you. That's a little confusing to think about it. Loving your enemies doesn't mean changing who you are so that you can get people to love you back. The goal in loving your enemies isn't to get them to love you. And I think this is really important. If you go into a difficult relationship hoping to get the person to love you back, you need to check that. We don't love our enemies out of some sort of self-interest need to be loved. If that's where you're at, you need to work on that first. Find the people who love you. Trust in God's love for you. Love yourself. Do the self-care. Do the hard work so that you know who you are and you can handle it. And if you're not there, that's okay. You don't have to be there right away. But that you're loving your enemies isn't in some sort of twisted way so that you can get more people to love you because you need that love. No, you don't need the love because you know you have community. There are people who love you. You are choosing to love yourself. You know God loves you. Boom. The goal in loving our enemies is simply that. To love our enemies without expecting anything in return. Or did we not pay attention to Jesus' parable? Loving someone in such a way that they can't pay you back. A number of years ago, I served on a board for an evangelical organization. It was evangelical. It was pretty open-minded. It was pretty moderate, but it was evangelical. And there was a pretty large board, but there was one member of the board who I just did not like. they're on the list. They were on the list. They're actually not anymore, but they were on the list. And I don't know if you've ever served on a team, there was just people that kind of bothered you, sometimes just personality differences or whatever. But this person was a lawyer, and I was young back then and pretty ambitious, and I something that's still true, I like to take a lot of big risks. And this person was risk averse and shot down all of my wonderful ideas. And I don't know if you've had great ideas before and they got shut down, but it's not fun. And they were like, and they were like using like logic and legal advice. They were a lawyer, like whatever. But it was horrible. And over time, I really grew frustrated with this person, and I would avoid them. I would avoid her, being careful what I'd say around her. And I began to view her as a barrier to the things that I hoped to see this organization do. I saw her as someone who only said no. And I wrote her off as such. I wrote her off as like a headache, an opponent. I wouldn't say enemy, I didn't hate her, those are strong words. But like no thank you. And that's how it went until this one day. Our board was meeting and we were discussing something very sensitive. You see, this board member had a daughter, and that daughter had applied for a part-time position with our organization. And she was a great candidate. She had the experience. She had the flexibility. There's no reason why she couldn't do the job well. She had great personality. She did well in the interviews. There was just one thing wrong, is that we were an evangelical organization and she was gay. Now, we were fairly moderate. So, we didn't tell her no right away. We met as a board to decide what we would do. So you can imagine my opponent, my no thanks board member, at a meeting that's been called in part to discuss whether we could hire her daughter, who she loved dearly. Well, as it was standard for board meetings of this nature, she eventually excused herself so that the board could speak freely about her daughter. But only after she had shared some words. And as she was talking and sharing her thoughts with the board, I don't remember what she said, but I remember what I felt. And all of a sudden, this opponent, this enemy, this no person, her humanity was showing. And she was hurting. And so she excused herself and she left. And you have to understand that she actually was part of my church. I was her pastor. That's why she was serving on the board of this organization. And, one of the things you have to learn as a pastor, this isn't to any of my credit, you just have to, we all have to learn. I had to put my pastor hat on, and I realized that it doesn't matter how I feel about this person personally. She needed a pastor in that moment. So my pastor hat got put on, and I went into pastor mode, and I walked out, and in pastor mode said, "I'm so sorry this is happening," and I gave her a hug. We ended up hiring her daughter for what it's worth, but neither one of us are a part of that organization anymore, and we've all moved on. This was over 8 years ago. And over the last 8 years, this individual has sent me messages on Facebook every once in a while. And I always thought it was strange. But they'd share, this lawyer would share personal perspectives and struggles and all of this sort of stuff. And I thought it was strange until recently, just this week. That's why I was reminded of this. She sent me a message and told her about some really hard stuff going on in her life and asked for prayer. And I said, of course I would. I'm not her pastor anymore. I'm not even sure what church she goes to. And this time, after asking for prayer, she said this. She said, "Your running out to hug me was a shining show of support during one of my most painful moments in my life." I'm here to tell you, it cost me nothing. And it meant everything to her. I share this not because I want you to think that this is what will happen every time you love your enemies. I'm here to tell you that that's actually probably the exception to the rule. As I think about my story, of all the times that I've ever felt called to love an opponent or to ask to love an opponent or tried to love somebody I was at odds with, this is the one story where I actually feel like it turned out pretty good. And as the exception to the rule, I hate to present it this way, friends, but I have to. This is how things work. There have been times when people have been out to get me and I didn't feel safe enough to offer them such compassion, or when I did, it was used against me, and more times than not, it hasn't worked out this way. And I think that's important to understand. Loving your enemies doesn't always mean they will love you in return. But man, it's great when they do. In fact, let me be very clear. Jesus loved his enemies, and they killed him. We'll look at 4 stories of an individual loving their enemies, 2 of Jesus, 1 of Stephen, 1 of Paul. All of the stories end in prison and death. So don't get your hopes up. This isn't safe. And you need to know your boundaries and what you're capable of and when you are and what you're willing to sacrifice. But there are moments. There are moments in this world when we look at humanity, when we look at the humanity of those we disagree with, and we choose to love them, and then somehow grace begins to break through, and then every once in a while something really beautiful happens. And someone finds the grace of God in the moment when they need it. And I would say that those moments make every other moment worth it, no matter the cost. I invite the band to come up, and I invite you all to pray with me. God, we are broken, fragile humans. We don't always know what to do. We don't always get it right. We don't always love each other well. We don't always love our neighbors as we love ourselves, and we don't always love ourselves. But God, we are trying. May your grace fall on us. May you wipe away the shame and the guilt that we experience when we fall short, so that we might rise up, know that we are loved, and choose to be a force of good in this world anyways, no matter the cost. We ask all of this in Jesus' name, the one who showed us the way and what it means to forgive his enemies. Amen.